Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is navigating today for a brighter tomorrow. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
It's the week ending Saturday the 10th of June, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Russia and Ukraine blaming each other for the destruction of a huge dam that then flooded Kherson, Prince Harry claiming at the High Court that the Mirror Group hacked his phone, and West Ham winning the Europa Conference League. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team, it's staff writer Harriet Marsden and global deputy editor Jessica Hullinger and Professor of Shakespeare Studies at the University of Oxford, Emma Smith. Oh, no, it's the other Emma Smith, although there is a thematic link with her story today. It's the one from BBC Sport. Hello, Emma. Harriet, you're kicking us off today. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Nearly 90 schoolgirls and some teachers were hospitalised in what is suspected to be deliberate poisonings in northern province of Afghanistan.
And at one point, she kind of pointed to her granddaughter who was sitting, right beside her with her head in her lap. And she said that she's afraid that her granddaughter will grow up and just like her, be uneducated, be illiterate. She won't have a brighter future.
A clip from an edition of the New York Times podcast, The Daily, on Monday about the situation in Afghanistan. What's been happening there this week?
So on Saturday, about 60 students and 3 staff members in one primary school fell ill after arriving at school. And the following day, another school nearby, a similar thing happened. Reporting numbers vary. They're sort of between 17 and 26, but it's very, very, very serious. There's basically nearly 90 girls and a few staff members who were hospitalised with severe neurological and respiratory symptoms.
I didn't think girls were allowed to go to school at all in Afghanistan. What's the situation there at the moment with girls' education?
So girls are allowed to attend primary school. They're not allowed to attend secondary schools. And obviously, because of that, after a while, that ban brought in a de facto university ban as well. So they are allowed to attend school at primary level. So we're talking about really small children here. The ages haven't been released of those who are hospitalized, but we're talking about girls who are under 11 years old, really small children.
It's a really shocking story, Emma, but it isn't the first time, is it? We've seen poison attacks on schoolgirls in the region.
Yeah, this represents a situation which is, it could be a worrying copycat case. There were recent so-called revenge poisonings in Iran in response to the hijab protests that we've discussed on this podcast previously. So it's a really worrying trend in the region of girls who are trying to seek an education at any age being attacked.
Who are the Taliban blaming, Jess?
So they are saying that it comes down to, conflict between the villages. They're sort of pointing fingers at the locals and saying, well, you're just fighting between each other. And they're basically saying we have nothing to do with this and we're looking into it. And of course, there's not really much to that. I mean, anyone from the outside would say this is quite obviously an attempt by the Taliban to insert a lot of fear into these younger girls and their families. And if you listen to the families of the children affected, a lot of them say we just don't know if we can continue to endure this anxiety of sending our girls to school.
Yeah. It's sort of similar in that sense, isn't it, to what you hear about in the US, where people are worried about school shootings?
I mean, similar anxiety, certainly. I think they are slightly different.
But it works, doesn't it, Harriet? If 2 schools have been poisoned, but everyone in Afghanistan is worried about sending their girls to school, then the Taliban are able to say, we let girls go to school, we let elementary children go to school, we're not stopping them, we haven't clamped down on it, and yet, in reality, they have.
I think there's two things to focus on here. Firstly, I don't think it's similar at all to what's going on in the US, as disastrous and horrific as that is. I think what we're looking at here seems to be a fairly clear-cut case of bioterrorism. This is targeted at schools of really, really, really small children, and schools, they don't have any security, and this is a very insidious way of attacking massive amounts of people by sneaking in beforehand, potentially. Obviously, this is just speculation at this point, but releasing perhaps certain poisons or certain toxins that could affect a large number of people. But it's not the first time that this has happened in Afghanistan. This is coming in a context of a series of attacks over the last decade. So I know Emma mentioned the attacks in Iran that have affected an estimated 13,000 people, mostly schoolgirls. So that's, it's a massive, massive, massive issue. But in Afghanistan, for example, in 2015, a reported 600 girls were targeted, that's the word used, in Herat province. The Taliban were blamed at that time by what was then the Western-backed government. And in 2012, there were 2 separate attacks in a northern province in Afghanistan in the same week. So 120 girls in one school and 160 in another. So with that context in mind of what's going on in neighboring Iran and what has previously occurred in Afghanistan and been blamed on the Taliban by officials at that time, would you send your children, your female children, your girls to school? Would you, in this context? And it's a huge number of kids, and it's also astonishingly easy to do.
What's the West's role in all of this, Emma? Because we have a Taliban government there because the West withdrew from Afghanistan, but it is the Taliban's responsibility, and this is the system that they're presiding over.
Yeah, and there's obviously only so much that other countries can do. The Taliban is the government of Afghanistan. The Western military forces chose to withdraw, so there's only so much that can be done. In April this year, Barbara Woodward, who's the UK ambassador to the UN, made a speech about how the UK will not abandon women and girls in Afghanistan. And the UK has given $662 million since April 2021 to address the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. But there is certainly a sense that in the West, we've sort of moved on. Our focus has moved on from Afghanistan. It's certainly not as focused on by Western media as they were a couple of years ago, which is why this terrible story of schoolgirls being poisoned is an underreported story that we're focusing on. And certainly from a financial perspective as well, the budget for Afghanistan aid has been reduced by the UN down from 4.6 billion to 3.2 billion this year, which is obviously still a huge amount of money, but it does symbolize the fact that from a Western perspective, Afghanistan is less of a focus currently, both from a humanitarian and a media perspective. But that, of course, that doesn't mean that things still aren't happening in Afghanistan, which are truly awful, like this story.
You do wonder, Jess, whether this kind of story, to the extent that it is being reported, actually puts a downward pressure on that revised aid budget rather than the reverse. I mean, Emma's suggesting there that, maybe people should have second thoughts before cutting the amount that's being sent to Afghanistan. But at the same time, others will say, when you send money to Afghanistan, you're sending it to the Taliban. You're bolstering their country, their regime.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, it is very difficult, I think, to know where the aid would be going, right? And it's become very difficult to distribute and to track and to know how it's being used. And part of that is systematic. I mean, the Taliban banned women from working in international NGOs and UN agencies. And before that ban came into place, 40% of NGO staff in Afghanistan were women. So this has really, really dramatically undercut aid efforts in the country. And so it's become harder to deliver properly. And yeah, I completely understand what you mean. I think like when these things happen and they become the sort of headline story, you think, of course, we should be helping, but how can we justify sending money to a country where it might just be going directly into the pockets of the people doing these terrible things?
And what about the rest of the region, Harriet? I mean, is Afghanistan a bit of a pariah now? I mean, even Iran doesn't condone this.
It's incredibly interesting. We're talking at what the West, whether or not the West is losing interest. And I would actually hugely disagree with that in terms of the UN specifically. It's not that long ago that the UN have been having very, very, very high level meetings about the Taliban, and the region's deputy secretary general arguing that there was need for recognition of the regime in order to use that recognition as leverage to tackle their humanitarian atrocities. But it's a really complicated question of whether or not the Taliban should be recognized as a legitimate government by the international community. And we've actually got a really interesting story on this on the UK website about whether or not the UN should recognize them and what the implications would be. Just focusing specifically on the Taliban, though, if it's the only country in the world that has effectively banned women's education, and it's not just banned women's education, it's also banned women working in most fields. It's banned women from entering public spaces like gyms and parks. Women aren't allowed to travel without a male guardian. The burqa mandate has come back. They have to cover head to toe outside. So with all of that in mind, that puts it on a level that is not comparable to any other country in the entire world, which is why Afghanistan is an international pariah and why it's experiencing such an unbelievably catastrophic humanitarian crisis, starvation, poverty, and mental health crisis facing the women as well. So in that sense, in terms of how not just unprecedented, because it's precedented by the Taliban last time, but in terms of how much worse it is than everywhere else, that would put it at odds with all its neighboring countries, even Iran.
Okay. Jess, you're up next after this.
Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is navigating today for a brighter tomorrow. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
Okay, Jess, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
A big boost for biodiversity.
One of the priorities of many international agreements is to try and monitor biodiversity at national scales. These networks represent a pre-existing nationally and internationally distributed infrastructure which may be doing this as a byproduct of their regular operation. And that's what's truly exciting about this, is that the infrastructure may already exist for national level biodiversity monitoring.
Scientists from Queen Mary University of London getting psyched about their latest study with York University Toronto. Jess, what's the story?
Yeah, so this week, researchers from the UK and Canada announced the discovery that air pollution monitors, filters that are located basically all over the world, can not only tell us about the quality of our air, but can also help to measure biodiversity by collecting something called eDNA, or environmental DNA.
Okay, so eDNA, what's that?
eDNA is basically trace amounts of genetic material that all living beings have and leave behind. So this is like cells, skin cells, hair. For animals, it would be like scales for fish. So it's everywhere. And ecologists love it because it is everywhere, and it's in the air, and it's in the soil, and it's in the water. And so it allows them to track certain species based on their biological markers that are left in this DNA in the soil, in the air, and in the water.
Okay. The air kind of makes sense with my very primitive understanding. You know, we've all seen those slow-mos on David Attenborough programs of flowers, like, you know, pollinating, and then you can imagine that's in the air. That's easy to see in an air sensor. How does an air sensor find bits of old DNA that are lingering in the air from a fish that's in the water? That just seems impossible.
Yeah, so the water and the soil is separate. So that's done separately. That's not necessarily done through air filtering. Specifically, this finding is specific to eDNA that's collected in the air by these filters that suck in air. The original intention of these would be to test the air quality for pollution, but actually they found a second use for them, which is to pull in the air, take in the DNA with it, and then be able to, researchers would take that DNA and be able to identify certain species biomarkers from that.
And the other thing that's quite exciting about this, Emma, is that all of the air sensors around the world, as I understand it, are all standardized. They all collect data in the same way. So you've got this network ready to harvest this data that we didn't even know could be there.
Absolutely. The researchers say these stations are very common. They are, as you say, the standard. Then, yeah, it's almost as if a perfect sort of ready-made solution for monitoring biodiversity has fallen into their laps. I mean, while researching this subject, which was something that I knew absolutely nothing about, it was fascinating. And I suppose it's also one of those things where don't quite consider just how difficult it is for scientists to keep track of ecosystem changes. I mean, there's a lack of infrastructure. It's methods such as having to use camera surveillance, where you can obviously only monitor a very small sort of concentrated area and try and extrapolate data from that. So using these stations, these filters, which can draw in a much sort of wider range of data of eDNA, it seems like a remarkable step forward.
And Harriet, what is the current state of global biodiversity at the moment? Why is it important to monitor what's out there?
Pretty bad. Oh, it's pretty bad. I actually, when I was researching this, I came across a study that said that species are actually going extinct so fast that we can't even discover them. The rate of extinction is outpacing our rate of discovery. So that's like a world first finding from this study led by Fudan University in China. And it's absolutely mind-blowing when you think about that. You think about the fact that these species, we don't even know that they exist before they're gone. And with that in mind, I would say that this is far from a perfect solution. Based on what I've read, the study co-author said it's unlikely that it'll be able to monitor abundance of species. And even though it could detect the rise of invasive species, it would take years and years and years of monitoring to establish those kinds of trends. And also, so far, it hasn't actually identified any unusual species or population movements yet. That's not to say that it won't, but so far, it hasn't. And in terms of the infrastructure already being there, it is there, but it's mostly so far in urban areas. Although, I mean, that could incentivize them to create more of an infrastructure in less urban areas, which would be good.
But theoretically then, Jess, it's kind of like having a nighttime camera, isn't it? You know, when wildlife documentarians say we set up this camera that can film at night and then we discovered a whole new behavioral system we didn't know about. Theoretically, there could be a species we don't know about that's living under our noses, even in urban areas, that this could pick up.
Yeah, theoretically. I mean, I think Harriet's right in that a lot of this, there are a lot of caveats to this research. And I think that they have put it out there specifically with the aim of demonstrating that this is a possibility. And part of the problem is that a lot of countries that use these air filters to monitor air pollution, they throw the filters away. They don't do anything with them. And so the researchers in this study see that as a huge waste of potential research data and information. And so I think they put this out as a way to say, hey, there's something interesting here. Please stop throwing your filters away. Let us have them in research. But I think to your point, yeah, absolutely. Like if it works, it's really fascinating that it could help identify, as Harriet says, the species that we don't even know are there yet before they go extinct. I mean, I read one statistic that said that researchers estimate that there are 8.7 million species on Earth. That could go up as high as 1 trillion, but we've only actually identified about 2 million of them. So we know there are millions and millions of species out there that we don't know exist, and this could potentially provide a way to identify a few of those.
Okay, so a new way of harvesting biological data, centralized mainly in urban areas. What could possibly go wrong, Jess?
Indeed. What could go wrong? So as you could predict, experts are a little bit worried about this. So in the past, the way that, let's say, police officers had gathered DNA would be from something like a large sample, like a drop of blood on a surface, right? But what eDNA does is it allows for very detailed analysis of genetic material based on a very small amount of it. So stuff that's in the air. And it can even identify things like hereditary traits, ancestral information, ethnic traits. And so there are concerns that this could be misused and abused, particularly within law enforcement. And also in larger areas where, let's say, like in China, where the state has an interest in tracking where ethnic minorities are. and targeting them for various reasons.
That's fascinating. I mean, even in a police context, Emma, even if it managed to come up with evidence, kind of like DNA did when they first discovered DNA, in a way that was revolutionary for capturing criminals, it's still in its infancy, isn't it? You wonder whether you could trust law enforcement to be using this kind of information and whether that should be regulated on.
Yeah, it's one of those things where when it's first discovered, it seems like a great step forward, and then if it gets used in the wrong way, it suddenly becomes a real issue. I mean, the thing is that eDNA isn't entirely new. It's been in consideration for the last couple of decades in terms of detecting invasive species, in terms of monitoring. And so it's not an entirely brand new discovery that scientists and researchers don't quite know what to do with. And obviously, in terms of the general topic that we have in this story, it is proving to be incredibly useful. There was a article this week about it on nature.com talking about researchers set up a station in London next to a deer park and were amazed by the sort of breadth of eDNA. They found 34 species of birds as well as various trees and plants and fungi. So it does have this incredible usefulness in terms of the natural research applications, but obviously it's when you start thinking about, okay, what other applications can it have, that you start to wonder about how ethically this is going to be handled, and hopefully it will be.
It's also just another job that's being outsourced to AI, isn't it, Harriet? Don't you feel sorry for all the biologists who used to go out with their nets?
No, because this could actually be great for them. So this was one thing that I thought the study really highlighted was currently a lot of this data, a lot of these observations, particularly in the UK, are done by volunteers, citizen scientists, having to do time-consuming and unpaid and lengthy observation. So actually, in that sense, this could be really, really great for them. And the current methods that we have are really patchy and unreliable, and they're usually based on very localized areas. And so I think that could be seen as a massive pro. But obviously, we're talking about the human implications of the use of eDNA, which I think it's worth noting that eDNA technology is already used to monitor wastewater for COVID and other pathogens. So there was a really, really interesting New York Times article about this, suggesting that it could pose dilemmas for the preservation of privacy and civil liberties, especially as the tech advances. But in terms of what the study is talking about, in terms of the monitoring of the air for biodiversity, for evidence of species, it's not necessarily the same issue that we're talking about here.
It's also a fun example, isn't it, of something being discovered when they were looking for something else. I'm trying to think of other examples, but, these sort of scientific accidents where a big discovery's come about and that's not even what they were looking for.
Yeah, it's sort of stumble upon something. Yeah, I mean, I think that's great, and I think that's exactly why they wanted to bring this to the global attention of global leaders in the world of ecology. Is that hopefully this will encourage, like I said, them to start saving their filters, and it would also provide such a wonderful built-in infrastructure. If it did work, it would mean that we didn't have to put up loads of new monitoring systems across the world. It would be a really nice and easy solution, but as we know, that often isn't the case.
Harriet.
So fun fact, actually, eDNA has already rediscovered a species that was previously thought to be extinct, which was an insect in Wales in 2020. So that's kind of cool. And you can't protect or monitor the risks to species if you don't know that they still exist.
Okay. Emma, you're up next after this. Okay, Emma, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
It's the way we learn about LGBT history about to change.
And what we wanted to do, or what we tried to do, and we've tried to do in this book, is to think about the ways in which the different economies, occupations, demographics, geographies of these places, what difference did these things make to the way people lived out and understood their queer lives, queer identities and communities.
Author and historian Matt Cook talking about his book Queer Beyond London to the Manchester University Press YouTube channel. And Emma, he's in the news this week.
He is. This week, the University of Oxford has appointed its first permanently endowed fellowship in LGBTQ plus history. And it is Professor Matt Cook, who in October will become the first chair of the history of sexualities at the University of Oxford at Mansfield College.
Well, the first, in any kind of university.
Yes.
So I suppose is it a scoop for Oxford that they've come in and got it, or is it actually kind of impressive that such a renowned university has done it?
I think it's a little bit of both, but primarily the latter. I mean, Professor Cook is one of the most preeminent historians in LGBT history in the UK. He's taught for 18 years at Birkbeck University. As he mentioned there, he's written plenty of books. He knows his stuff. But I think what's more important in sort of the grander scheme of things is that it represents the importance and extent of queer history in the UK, and also about how it will be taught at one of the most respected universities in the world. We'll have a specialist LGBTQ history lecturer, which I think is a good thing, because often, Professor Cook has said himself that often queer history is taught as a marginal pursuit, but having a dedicated professor, dedicated department will help solidify in the mainstream teaching these things, queer history, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah. It's not as if gay theory in universities is new, though, is it, Jessica? I think there's a danger where people talk about the teaching of queer history as being a new discipline, that you forget that for decades people have been talking about. I mean, my English tutor at Oxford was this guy called Michael Gearin-Tosh, and his speciality was essentially Shakespeare through a homosexual lens. You know, are the boys really all pining for each other? What's all that cross-dressing about? What's Macbeth trying to prove, etc.? That was the thrust of my degree. And I wasn't studying queer English. I was studying just, English and theatre. So it's not like the subject or the area has been ignored before completely.
Yeah, I think that the point is that it will be taught from the perspective of, like, let's not just look at, people who were queer in English history. Let's look at the history of LGBTQ communities here and what has happened in those communities, and explore what that means for today. I mean, I think there's also another aspect here in that it seems like Professor Cook really wants to expand the conversations between other queer professors, other queer educators, and really spark interesting conversations. And as Emma has said, sort of cement this as part of the curriculum. LGBTQ history has been sort of neglected. And also there is a pushback in various parts of the world. I'm thinking of America in particular, where they don't want to teach LGBTQ history in schools. And I think having this at such a high level in the education world sends a real message that this isn't going to be ignored.
Yeah, I mean, wherever you stand on the sort of culture wars, Harriet, I mean, sort of facts are facts, aren't they? We've had a series of gay/bisexual monarchs here in the UK. It seems weird that it's taken such a long time for people to talk about that.
That's exactly what I thought when I was reading this story. What astonished me was that this was the UK's first appointment of this kind. I was absolutely astonished by that. I genuinely had no idea that that was the case, because as you said, LGBTQ history is kind of brought into all sorts of different disciplines via, for example, art or medicine or law or history or culture, but I had no idea that there wasn't some type of official fellowship appointment that could, as Jess was saying, coordinate between the disciplines and between the educators as well. I was absolutely astonished. And considering that in the last UK census, approximately 10% of respondents to the sexuality question said they weren't straight. So we're talking about a massive, massive, massive number of people in the UK alone. And obviously, I think it goes without saying that the LGBTQ and queer communities have been hugely overrepresented and influential in artistic spaces, cultural revolutions, civil rights movements, dance, film, theatre, as you said, Shakespeare, you name it. So in that sense, I really was surprised that this hadn't happened before. And I was very interested to see whether other universities would follow suit.
What's the kind of thing he'll be teaching, do you think, Emma?
Well, there's a huge range of things that he could be teaching. I mean, in terms of his background and his knowledge, it's incredibly... There is a range of LGBTQ histories that he could teach. He co-authored the National Trust's first LGBTQ guidebook, Prejudice and Pride, and has advised on a range of other museum and heritage projects. But he also has a real expertise in more modern queer history. That book that he was talking about in the clip, Queer Beyond London, was focused on queer urban life. And I think that it would be useful for him to teach about a wide range of queer history, because one of the criticisms that so often gets thrown about towards queer people is the idea of it being a modern phenomenon, a fad, a trend, where the fact is that queer people and queer history it's existed for an awfully long time. And I think that you mentioned the culture wars and sort of things like that in brief, but the fact is that the University of Oxford is nearly 1,000 years old. If there's one institution in the UK that is not, you could not accuse of being, a modern sort of culturally trendy organisation, it's the University of Oxford. And if that institution, one of the great institutions of UK life, is seeing fit to permanently appoint a chair in the history of sexualities, I think that is an indication that this is history that is worth knowing and teaching and remembering.
There is, though, isn't there, Jess? You alluded to this, a kind of feeling, particularly in the United States, and Emma was sort of referring to this as well, really, that universities in particular are this kind of festering pit of woke culture. So does this actually just add grist to that mill, really? It seems like progress for people who think, oh, this is a great idea and of course this should be represented. But actually for the people who don't, for the people who would rather have less of this is making it worse. This is them saying it's them and us.
I don't think so. I mean, I think that, of course, they might take it that way, but I think there is more of a gain than there is a loss here, certainly. I think, especially given Oxford's place in the world of higher education, I think that this should be seen much more as a win than as a detriment. Yes, of course, in America, and especially it's not necessarily in higher education, although those are the focus of the sort of the culture wars. But most of the bans seem to be focused on primary schools or on younger children, which is also really quite concerning. But yeah, no, I think that this is definitely a win. And, I was really interested actually researching how LGBTQ history is taught here in the UK, and I learned that Scotland became the first country in the world to add it to their school curriculum in 2021, which was interesting. And also in 2020, secondary schools and primary schools in England had to start teaching their students about sexual orientation and gender identity. So generally, while those things seem very late, should have happened much sooner, I think I see an encouraging trend.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Because if there is that trickle-down effect as well, if Oxford University are doing it, then other universities are doing it, as you implied, Harriet, in the future, then also, I suppose, at sixth form.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned that people could kind of culture war this appointment and accuse it of being an emblem of the woke festering mindset of the modern trendy university. But it seems a bit far-fetched given that LGBTQ history, like Emma says, is very, very old. It has happened. These things have happened. People do exist. They have always existed. There is a wealth of factual information that cannot be denied. And it's not about what the so-called ideology you're pushing or how you may or may not be affecting or teaching children or young people. It happened. And you can't get away from that. You cannot get away from the existence of LGBTQ people or history. So in that sense, it doesn't seem to me legitimate to accuse this of being of any kind of ideology when we study history, we study culture, we study people.
One of the reasons why I brought up this topic was because it is Pride Month. Happy Pride, everyone. And obviously, when Pride Month rolls around, a lot of stuff from large companies, corporations, you get, the rainbow flags appear everywhere. And it's, on one level, it's very, very good to see. As someone who is a queer person, I enjoy seeing it. It brings a little smile. But obviously, with it comes all these sort of, these stories, as you mentioned, sort of cultural stories in the UK. There's been the fact that Oxfam had to delete a Pride Month video after it was targeted by anti-trans activists. In the US, we've seen Target having to remove some of their Pride collection. We've seen the Republican presidential candidates, like of Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, all making anti-LGBT and especially anti-trans comments. So when it comes to sort of like the news agenda, that it can often be especially during Pride Month, quite a lot of negativity. But when there's a story like the one that's come out of University of Oxford, which is not just a fleeting sort of culture war discussion or news, it's something that's could well be a long-term, appointment. And it's, like I say, one of the oldest institutions in the UK, breaking new ground. That's first chair of history of sexualities in its 1,000-year history. that's the kind of thing that actually is worth celebrating in Pride Month.
On which note, we reach the end of this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Harriet, Jess and Emma. You can follow this show with pride and get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tapping follow. Go on, it's free. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Harriet Wells at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week,